every single Aardvark interaction, we raised $7.5 million. We raised $2 million in seed financing, and we raised $5.5 million in a Series A. And I think that that's informative, that good institutional investors are sort of more willing to take a leap about whether you can automate something that you're on the path to automating than whether or not this product that you're building will be used by anyone once you're finally done building it. And we also were able to recruit a core team and much better engineers because they could see where this was going, they could see the process. And so this is sort of the path. You know, you start with the black line, which is what the humans were doing, full human judgment initially, but then their actions became more and more constrained, and then finally they were basically automatons. They could only do very specific things, press buttons. And then on the other side, the automated system, which starts just sort of getting a sense of what's going on. Then it starts to be reasonably predictive, but with low accuracy. Then it sort of requires human approval for every action that it would take, and then finally it takes over. And I think the genius here, which is sort of to Damon's credit, is predicting that these lines would cross in 9 months. If they cross in 1 month, it's not hard enough. If they cross in 4 years, it's a disaster. Everyone's already left. And so then the final step was really the refinement, which is what most people think about as user-centered design, but for us came 18 months in. And there, we constantly would bring in users to try out different things. We'd have 6 to 12 users a week for user research sessions, every single week, over 30 months. And the speed with which you're able to learn, the rate at which you're able to abandon the bad ideas before it's ever engineered, is attributable to this process being fully adopted. And then you also see here there's a hijacking tool where someone who was full-time could basically pretend to be Aardvark and put people through alternate flows. And then we would send emails to those people soliciting feedback, and we'd get about a 50% response rate about what people thought of that test we put people in. And it's here worth to think about that the goal is eventual product market fit. Most entrepreneurs say, I want to build as good of a product as quickly as I can. That's wrong. You want to get better and better at learning. You want to focus on the second derivative, on acceleration. And if you don't have legacy obstacles like terrible co-founders who you hate or a brand that's been ruined, then as long as you don't run out of money, if your second derivative is good, you'll leave everyone else in the dust. And everyone thinks about the hockey stick, but they think about the hockey stick of user growth. We think of the hockey stick of engineering progress. And it's fine to be really flat for a while, but what you want is 2 years down the line for you to be rocketing and to be doing more in a day than you used to do in 6 months. That's what's going to let you leave people in the dust. So to give it back to Damon about how we would actually do this in practice.
Great. So there we are, and we now know we want to build an Aardvark. We have a pretty good idea what it's like from this long Wizard of Oz testing that we've done. But the fact is, even then, you're not anywhere near done with this process. You're at the beginning then you have something worth iterating on. So it's all about the process that'll take you forward. So here's a little schematic of what our process is. This is once we have our minimal viable product concept, and we're operating with it, users are using it, and we're continuing to do this loop again and again. The most important part is at the top, this learn from users idea. So as Max says, we had people coming in every week, and it's kind of extraordinary. We committed to doing that. You can get your friends to come in. You can grab people off the street. You can throw up listings on Craigslist and say, hey, I'll give you a $15 Starbucks card if you come in and look at my mock-ups. So we had people coming in. We're learning from them that way. We're also learning from users by setting up a community forum, letting them send in information to that. We're also learning from metrics dashboards that we've set up, split testing every feature we built. Now, learning isn't just something you play lip service to. The entire team reviewed what we called our weekly learnings every week. We'd put together a digest of the things that we had so that everybody on the team was on the same page, whether you're an engineer, product designer, an ops person, everybody knew what was going on so that we could, as a group, be able to make good decisions about how to proceed. So the way we would operate is, given all this learning, we'd say, okay, what are the key problems we want to knock off? What are the things that are hurting us the most right now? And we'd enter into a design phase, again, a very collaborative thing, which we can talk more about. Once we came out with some candidate designs that we thought would solve the problem, the next step is to say, well, do those really solve the problem? So before, again, you invest engineering effort in it, sanity check it. We'd make more mock-ups, we'd bring in more users, put them in front of pieces of paper, and say, what does this suggest to you, this button? What do you think it would do? What are your expectations for it? Then we'd show them what would happen if they hit the button. We'd say, is that what you expected? What did you want to have happen? We sound a little bit like psychoanalysts when this happens, but it's really valuable because you get language from the users, and their very phrases help pull you away from your own misguided intuitions. We also do a full design review with the team because, let's face it, the team is more committed to the product than even the most power user could be. Then, in the product development side, before, again, we would commit a line of code, we would first share implementation notes. We had a very horizontal engineering team in that there's a lot of cross-functional training. Instead of having individuals with their components, everybody knew one or two components very well, but was fluent in most aspects of the system. Therefore, it was really helpful to be able to send out implementation notes for how you're going to build this new thing, whether it's just a new feature or a whole new node. Finally, we get around to implementation, and then immediately after implementation, we're learning from users again. We're split testing to see how people responded to the new features. We're actually reaching out to people and saying, hey, will you come in and talk to us about our product? And as Max says, we get about 50% response rates. If you're really friendly to people and you tell them, we're listening to you, and then in fact you do listen to them, and they can track in your community boards, your feature forums, that you're actually building the things that they're requesting and complaining about, they'll be very responsive to you. So that last slide I showed you is a lot about our kind of product design cycle. Now, and the premise here, in case it's not large enough, is assume you are wrong. And then you'll be correct in that assumption, at least, if nothing else. Now, it's not just with the product design that you're probably wrong. It's also with your day-to-day operational process. That's not over also. So just as we are iterating with the product itself and what it's doing and how it's doing it, we're also iterating with how we interact with each other. We started off, for instance, by doing 3 to 4 month large cycles where we said, oh, there's this huge thing that we have to build, and we're going to kind of go away and build it and then kind of come back when it's done. We'd move to 4 to 6 week cycles by the end. And the way this process would work is quite simple. The whole team would gather and say, of all these learnings, what's the most important thing to do? We'd pull off 3 or 4 from a list of dozens and dozens that the team agreed were the most crucial things to do. We'd form ad hoc groups to form them. We'd bring in a few engineers, a researcher, an ops person, and say, okay, this group will go solve that problem. They'd define what the metrics would be that would count as success for solving that problem. And then, we're off and running. So that process is very different from where we started. And the reason it worked is because after every iteration, we'd have a big retrospective. Everybody would gather around and say, okay, what worked and what didn't. It's this type of kind of hyper-communication and hyper-iteration that allowed us to move extremely quickly. Now, you have to have certain kinds of people who are willing to play that game with you. It's not easy. You can't just go away and come up with your own dream and come back and have everybody applaud. You have to have people who are willing to play with the rest of the team. So having the time, again, emphasizing this theme of patience, having the time to hire people who are going to be a good cultural fit for this kind of process is absolutely crucial. Now, I think I've spoken largely to this idea of collective wisdom before, but I want to say that it's not just the collective wisdom of your team, it's also the collective wisdom of your user base, listening to them, and then finally, of all of your advisors and investors who all have different ideas about what to do. That means you should listen to all of them. People often think, oh, well, 2 people said opposite things, and they kind of, as an entrepreneur, you tend to just let those cancel out. You say, well, I can't possibly satisfy them. Part of what your job is as an entrepreneur is to let yourself be barraged by opposing viewpoints and realize that over time, you'll settle into what the right answer is. So we would actually put into our schedule times where we're going to do nothing but allow ourselves to confront opposing viewpoints. In the long run, it pays off, though. In the short term, it pays a lot of headaches. Now, while we're doing this, since as founders, we're being kind of subjected to this onslaught of information, we thought the best way to have really a common, uniform culture across the team is to make sure that everybody else is also. So extreme transparency is one of the ways to achieve that. Just like we share the learnings, the good and the bad about our product with every weekly cycle, similarly, when we have board meetings, immediately afterwards, we come back to our team and we say, here's what happened in the board meeting. Here's what we presented to the board. Here's what they said back to us. Our team can tell if we're scared. Our team can tell if we're hopeful. Our team needs to know those things so that it can adjust its own pace, so it can help steer this large ship. If you do all of these things, as Max says, you have a small chance of succeeding, and that's really all you can hope for. The last thing I want to say here is The other dominant theme, I think, in doing a startup is basically one of gratefulness. You're first of all grateful to your team for spending the time doing this project with you. You're grateful to your investors for supporting you, to your advisors for continuing to come back to more, to your users for spontaneously saying things like, I love Aardvark. Where does that come from? That's a fantastic sentiment. So if you're not prepared to be grateful, you shouldn't do a startup. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
We're going to experiment with the process of doing Q&A while doing the laptop swap, because we listen to customer feedback around here. But customers don't necessarily know what they want, okay, so it might not be a good idea. Not necessarily. All right, let's take the first question right here in the front, and then hopefully we can pass the mic around.
So there's been a lot of talk today about finding bad ideas and moving on to the next thing. How do you know when what you just found out is that you have a good idea that was poorly executed, and you just need to do it better?
That's a really interesting question. So the question was, there's one sort of pivot, which is the pivot of creating a product, creating a prototype, and getting it out there and having people tell you mean things about it, or just not adopt it. Then there's another kind of pivot where you think, oh, this was a great idea, it's not functioning right. The implementation right, or you haven't executed well enough on this idea, either at an implementation level or a team level, I suppose you mean. Or design level. Yeah, it's interesting. We had a few instances of this along the way with, not with the whole product idea, but with individual features that we tried to pull together. And what would happen, for instance, we didn't have any visual design skills on our team. That's a great example. So we would have some great idea for functionality for the interaction design of what should happen, but we'd put something out and people's first reaction would be, wow, that's a funny looking page that you have.